Okay, welcome back. When we left off last time, we had just finished a discussion on the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. We talked about major hormones that come from each area and their roles within the human body. So we're going to pick up our discussion of endocrine glands with the thyroid gland. As you can see on the screen, the thyroid gland kind of has a butterfly shape, right? If we look at this bottom picture, we can see that it resembles kind of the general shape of a butterfly. You have the narrow region here in the middle that connects the two wings, right? So the two lateral lobes are connected by a centralized portion known as the isthmus. And that's a term that we'll see in anatomy. It describes a narrow region that connects two structures. So you'll see isthmus in other organs. In particular, we'll talk about it when we look at the uterus. But in this case, we can see that this narrow portion, this isthmus, is connecting the two lobes of the thyroid. When we describe the position of the thyroid gland, we say that it is anterior to the trachea. So in this top picture, you can see that the gland kind of sits in front of the windpipe or the trachea. And then we could also say it's inferior to the larynx, right? So that's kind of what this structure is. It kind of looks like a shield. This is the larynx, or what we would call the voice box, and we can see that the placement of the thyroid gland would be inferior to the larynx. We'll talk a little bit more about the structure of the gland when we look at the tissue slides in our laboratory activity, but I just kind of want to remind you that when we look at the lobes of the thyroid gland, we're going to see that organization within the gland is follicles. So you'll see these tiny little circles or circular structures within the gland when you look at it underneath the microscope, and those are known as follicles. The cells that line the follicle we would call follicular cells. The cells that lie between the follicles are known as parafollicular. Major hormones that come from the thyroid gland, we've already talked about two of them. So we remember that T3 stands for triiodothyronine, and T4 stands for thyroxine, or we could call it tetraiodothyronine. And the major difference between these two is the fact that T3 has 3 iodine atoms attached and T4 has 4 iodine atoms attached. T3 and T4 are going to come from the follicular cells. So the secreting cell for T3 and T4 is the follicular cells. They're responsible for the release of T3 and T4. And when we're talking about both of them together, we will say those are the thyroid hormones. And so if you look at my screen, I have in bold here the action of the thyroid hormones. All of these that are listed, all these actions that are listed are going to be associated with T3 and T4. There is another hormone, though, that comes from the thyroid gland, and that one is called calcitonin. So CT stands for calcitonin. And this hormone is going to be important in calcium homeostasis, or calcium balance in the blood, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we've talked about secreting cells for T3 and T4. We said the secreting cell are the follicular cells. T3 and T4 are going to search for their target, which is going to be body cells. We're going to see that there are many different types of cells within the body that have receptors for T3 and T4 hormones. And when we talk about their functions in a moment, it's going to make sense why we would see body cells or a variety of different cell types having receptors for T3 and T4 in particular. So let's jump down here to function. We can see that the first action of thyroid hormones would be to increase the BMR by stimulating the use of cellular oxygen to produce ATP. So BMR is an abbreviation that stands for basal metabolic rate. The basal metabolic rate. And what this means is that when T3 and T4 interact with their target cell, they're going to stimulate those cells to increase their uptake of oxygen. And you might remember from 107 that when cells increase their uptake of oxygen, it allows them to produce a larger volume of ATP. We can make more ATP in the presence of oxygen than we can in the absence of oxygen. When BMR increases, the cellular metabolism of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins are also going to increase. We can see that one of the actions that's going to result because of an increase in BMR is the second function, which is stimulation of sodium-potassium pumps. Now, sodium-potassium pumps, remember, these are protein channels that are inserted in the membrane of our biological cells and are responsible for exchanging sodium ions for potassium ions. As we increase the number of sodium-potassium pumps, heat is going to be given off as a byproduct of this activity. And we have a term for that, right? So as we have increased activity in the cell, generation of ATP, using that energy to make these sodium-potassium pumps, we're going to see a byproduct form from all that activity, and that byproduct is heat. And the production of heat in this manner is called the calorogenic effect. We could say that because of this, there's a role for thyroid gland when it comes to regulation of normal body temperature. The third thing we're going to see is that we're going to get an increase in protein synthesis and an increase in the use of glucose and fatty acids for ATP production. So taking in the oxygen is one part of producing ATP. We know we also need a fuel source, and so we're going to see the use of glucose to generate ATP and the use of fatty acids to generate ATP. And then the last thing I want to talk about is that often when we look at the role of thyroid hormones, we can see that it plays a role in the acceleration of body growth. They are especially important for the development of the nervous system. They promote synapse formation, myelin production, and growth of the dendrites, which were those small neuronal processes that extend from the cell body of a neuron. Thyroid hormones are also required for the growth of the skeletal system. They promote formation of ossification centers in developing bones, synthesis of many bone proteins, and secretion of growth hormone and insulin-like growth factors. Deficiency of thyroid hormones during fetal development, infancy, or childhood can cause severe mental retardation and stunted bone growth. The next gland that we're going to focus on is the parathyroid glands. You might recall that the parathyroid glands are embedded on the dorsal surface of the thyroid gland. We know that dorsal is a term that we apply to the back or the posterior surface. So they're embedded on the back side of the thyroid. And if we're thinking about the shape of the thyroid gland, it would be on the lateral lobes, right? So embedded on the back surface or the posterior surface of the lobes of the thyroid gland. If we look at the histology of a parathyroid gland, we'll see that there are two major cell types found within the gland. We have one group of cells that are called the chief cells, and their role is to produce PTH. And PTH is a hormone called parathyroid hormone. The other cell that's found in the parathyroid gland is called oxyphil cells, but as of now, that function is not well understood. As we think of the role of parathyroid hormone, remember, secreting cell is going to be the chief cells. The hormone is called PTH, and the target for parathyroid hormone is going to be bone cells. We can see at the bottom of the screen that parathyroid hormone is a major regulator of calcium, magnesium, and phosphate. And we know that these are all minerals that are very important for formation of healthy bone tissue. The specific role of parathyroid hormone is to target those osteoclasts. Now remember those bone cells? These are the cells that were really important in completing resorption in bone tissue in order to keep our bones healthy. Right? They constantly initiated remodeling, and that is a very important process of making sure that our bones stay healthy. So when parathyroid hormone interacts with its target cell, it's going to increase calcium levels in the blood. So PTH, the function, when it finds its target cell or the bone cell, is to increase the calcium levels in the blood. And I always like to use letters when I can to help me remember functions. And so the P in PTH should stand for promote bone resorption. And we know that when we promote bone resorption or osteoclast activity, it's going to break down bone tissue. And when we break down bone tissue, it's going to free up the calcium as well as these other ions that are stored within the bone. And it allows that calcium to enter the blood. This is going to be important because you might recall from your discussion in muscle and nervous system that calcium is a really important ion for regulating activity. And our bones are our reservoir for calcium. So we're going to need calcium in the blood. And one way to regulate calcium levels in the blood is through freeing that calcium from the bone reservoir or bone. And so parathyroid hormone is going to be really important for that action. On the flip side, you might remember that on the previous slide I talked about a hormone known as calcitonin, and we abbreviated it CT. And we said that calcitonin came from the parafollicular cells, right? So the secreting cell for calcitonin is parafollicular cells of the thyroid. And when it interacts with the osteoclasts, it slows down or inhibits their activity. And so we would say that there's a decrease in calcium levels that result when calcitonin interacts with its target cell. Now lately there's been some research that suggests that the mechanism for calcitonin doesn't play out as it was previously understood. So for now, we're just going to say that calcium levels are regulated by calcitonin. Okay. So if you've been following along in the text, you'll see that little blurb in the textbook that suggests that what we previously thought was the mechanism for calcitonin communication is now being rewritten. We do know that parathyroid hormone increases calcium levels in the blood, and we see a role for calcitonin when calcium levels are high. So we're just going to work on that premise. One other thing that I skipped over, and I should probably go back and mention, is that with parathyroid hormone, we see it's a major regulator of calcium, magnesium, and phosphate in the blood. We also see that it's going to promote the formation of the hormone calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D. And this is going to be important because it enables us to absorb calcium from our digestive tract. So when we have active calcitriol, we can absorb the calcium that's in our food from the digestive tract into the blood. And so that's going to be an important role for parathyroid hormone as well, because it's ensuring that not only are we using the calcium that's stored in our bones, but we're also replenishing with the calcium from our diet. The next group of glands that we're going to talk about are the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands, remember we said, had another name. We can also refer to them as suprarenal. The suprarenal glands or the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidney, and often you'll hear people describe them as looking somewhat like a witch's hat because they have this triangular point and then kind of a broad base. And so often you'll hear people kind of commonly refer to their shape as a witch's hat. All right, so the adrenal gland we can split into two parts. And we're going to see that we're going to be able to do this with other glands as well. So when we talk about structures, we're going to see cortex and medulla. These are common anatomical terms. In the cortex, I always like to remind students that the cortex begins with the letter C, and the C can remind you of the word crust. And the cortex, for no matter what structure that you're looking at, the cortex will always be on the periphery or on the outside, like the crust. Okay, so the adrenal cortex is the region that is going to be kind of on the perimeter or to the outside. The adrenal medulla begins with the letter M, and we can use the M for middle. And this is going to be the more centralized portion of a structure. So you'll see cortex and medulla with the lymph node, you'll see it with the kidney, and we're using it here with the adrenal glands. So this kind of phrasing or term is a common way to refer to the anatomy of a structure. So adrenal cortex is the region of the adrenal gland that is to the outside or the exterior, and the adrenal medulla is the middle portion. Sometimes you'll hear people, especially if they're speaking British English, you'll hear them refer to it as the medulla, right? So you might hear some people saying medulla, and you might also hear medulla. As you can see, they're going to do different things, or they do different roles within the adrenal gland. So the adrenal cortex is going to be important for producing steroid hormones that are essential for life. And so there's two things that I want to point out here in this statement. The first one is that all hormones that come from the adrenal cortex are steroid hormones, right? So if we're talking about a hormone that is released from the adrenal cortex, right away you know that it's a steroid, and so you can conclude that when it finds its target, it's going to follow that lipid-soluble mechanism of action, based on what we've talked about previously in the class. We also see that hormones that come from the adrenal cortex, they are essential for life. So if there, for some reason, is complete loss of these hormones, that cortex isn't secreting them, it's going to lead to death unless hormone replacement therapy is initiated, because we're going to see that major hormones that come from this region are going to be important for regulating water balance and mineral balance. And we know that both of those are going to be essential for maintaining homeostasis in the body. Water is very important, and we know that mineral balance is going to be important when it comes to communication. The second major region, the adrenal medulla, it gives us three hormones, and we're going to talk about two of them. We'll talk about norepinephrine and epinephrine. Remember, I told you that these were examples of amine hormones, right? Those modified amino acids. So they're going to have a water-soluble mechanism of action. They're not essential for life, right? So unlike the hormones that come from the adrenal cortex, the hormones that are released from the adrenal medulla are not essential for life, but they help to intensify or enhance our body responses, right? So, and I'm talking in particular about epinephrine and norepinephrine. These also have other names. So you might have heard adrenaline or noradrenaline. That would be, adrenaline is another way to refer to epinephrine, and noradrenaline is another way to refer to norepinephrine. All right, so when we look at the arrangement of cells in the adrenal cortex, we're going to see we can divide the cortex into different regions based on how the cells are arranged. And this is something that we'll talk about in lab as well. You should recognize this image if you've already had your lab. We'll look at the adrenal gland underneath the microscope, and this is very similar to what we'll see when we look at it with the light microscope. So the first zone, the zona glomerulosa, is a pretty narrow region. It doesn't take up very much of the adrenal cortex, right? So I'm going to put ZG here because this is denoting the zona glomerulosa. When we look at these underneath the microscope, you'll see that the cell arrangement, you can kind of see it here on the screen, is kind of circular. Those cells are in little circular clusters. And that's kind of what glomerulosa means. A glomerulus is a ball-shaped structure that we'll see be very important in function of the kidney. And so glomerulosa, it kind of gets that name because of the way the cells are arranged. They're arranged in these tiny cluster-like shapes that resemble kind of a ball-shaped structure. The major class of hormones that come from the zona glomerulosa are the mineralocorticoids. Okay, so mineralocorticoids is not referring to a particular hormone, it's referring to a class. An example of a mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. So this is going to be our example of the hormone. Aldosterone is a hormone that would fit in the class of mineralocorticoids. So the secreting cell for aldosterone is going to be this region, the zona glomerulosa. And aldosterone's target is going to be cells in the kidney. And the function for aldosterone is to regulate sodium, potassium balance, and to a lesser extent, regulate the balance of hydrogen ions. Okay, so when we're talking about the function for aldosterone, we're going to see that its major role is to regulate the balance of sodium ions and potassium ions. And then we're also going to see that to a lesser extent, it's going to help regulate the excretion of the hydrogen ions into the urine. And that's going to be important for pH. We're going to see that with the regulation of the sodium and potassium ions, there's going to be a role here with blood pressure maintenance, because when you regulate sodium ions, when you hold on to the sodium ions, a result that will occur because of that action is to retain water. So when aldosterone stimulates the kidneys to retain sodium, it will draw water as a secondary action. And we'll see that aldosterone, because of this, has a role in regulating blood volume and blood pressure. The second region makes up the bulk of the adrenal cortex, right? So let me change my ink color. We'll do it in purple. And we can see from the bottom here of our zona glomerulosa until this region right here. So a pretty big part of the adrenal cortex is going to be the zona fasciculata. Now when you look at this word, you should see kind of the root here, fascicle. And remember talking about fascicles, we talked about them with muscle tissue, and we also talked about them with nervous tissue. They were those long columns or structures that we saw in organization of nerve tissue and muscle tissue. And so when we look at these very closely underneath the microscope, we're going to see that the cells tend to be organized in columns. And it's not straight columns, right? So if you're looking for straight columns, you're not going to see that. But what you're going to see is if you think about when you stack coins, like pennies, as your stack gets taller, it kind of tends to weave to the right or to the left. It's not really a straight column. And so that's what we'll see. We'll see that when we look at the zona fasciculata, the majority of the cells seem to be kind of organized in these column-shaped structures. And so that's why this is called the zona fasciculata. The class of hormones that come from this region are called glucocorticoids. So the class that comes from here are glucocorticoids. And you can see that we have a variety of different examples. Cortisol will be the one that I will use. But corticosterone, cortisone would be other examples of hormones that could be classified as a glucocorticoid. When we think about function of glucocorticoids, when they find their target, there's going to be a variety. So for simplicity, the secreting cell for cortisol is going to be zona fasciculata. But when we talk about the target cell, we can put body here because we're going to see that there's going to be a variety of different targets for cortisol. So let's talk a little bit about function for a moment. Function for a cortisol when it finds its target cell. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to initiate the breakdown of proteins. Right? So we think about the role for cortisol. The first one is going to be protein degradation. And because there's so many, I'm going to exit out of the presentation for just a second. want to add a slide here. I want to add a slide so I have room to write. All right, so what we're doing right now is we are talking about the major roles for the hormone cortisol when it finds its target cell. Right, so cortisol function. And I told you that the first kind of activity that we could associate with cortisol once it's interacted with its target cell is protein degradation. You know the word degradation means to break down, right? So protein degradation. This is going to happen particularly in muscle tissue. So it's going to be the breakdown of those muscle proteins. And as we have breakdown of proteins, it's going to lead to liberation of amino acid. Liberates the amino acids. Remember, those are the building blocks of protein. And once those amino acids are free, they can be used to generate ATP. Okay, so the first function that we can associate with cortisol when it interacts with its target cell is to initiate protein degradation. And we said specifically, we're talking about the bulk of this activity happening within muscle tissue, and as those proteins are broken down, it liberates amino acids, and that frees the amino acids up to be used elsewhere. The second major activity that we can associate with cortisol function is glucose formation. And this is going to apply in particular to cells in the liver, but when cortisol interacts with cells in the liver, it can manufacture new glucose. And it does this by taking certain amino acids or lactic acids and converting them into glucose. And so we have a term that describes this. This activity is known as gluconeogenesis. And if we were to break down this word, gluco we know is a prefix that means sugar. Neo is a prefix that means new. And genesis means to create. Right, or new onset. So cortisol can cause cells in the liver to take certain amino acids or lactic acid and convert it into available glucose when our glucose levels are low. And this action is called a gluconeogenesis. The third thing we'll see happen with cortisol function is lipolysis. And this is the breakdown of lipid. And obviously when we break down lipid, we're going to free up fatty acids. And those fatty acids we know can be used to generate ATP. So it's another source of fuel. And if we think about where this is happening, breakdown of lipid, it's going to target adipose tissue because that's our major storage area for triglyceride. So when cortisol interacts with adipose cells, it can induce lipolysis and initiate the breakdown of lipid. That frees up fatty acids. Those fatty acids can then be used to generate ATP, which we know is important for running or managing a lot of cellular processes. Another thing we're going to associate with cortisol function is it's going to suppress or decrease white blood cell activity. So they inhibit white blood cells that participate in inflammatory responses from being able to do their job, which is why if you've seen anybody that's had an allergic reaction, that's what's happening. Their white blood cells are carrying out the inflammatory response as a protective mechanism. And so when they are giving a steroid, we often see that those symptoms abate because cortisol is going to play a role in decreasing or suppressing white blood cell activity. Right, so if we're thinking of all of the major things that we can associate with the cortisol function, these are major activities that we can apply to cortisol when it interacts with its target cell. The very last thing I'm going to add is we have two words that kind of sound similar. So we have gluconeogenesis, and I said this was to use certain amino acids like alanine and glycine or lactic acid and make new available glucose. Another thing that cortisol can do is it can stimulate glycogenolysis. And this is breakdown of glycogen stores. And we know that this is going to lead to freeing up glucose. And then the glucose would be freed to use in the blood for manufacture of ATP. Okay, so glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen stores. Gluconeogenesis is taking certain amino acids or lactic acid and making available glucose, new glucose. So resuming our presentation, the next thing we need to talk about are the hormones that will come from the zona reticularis. We're not going to say too much about them, but you'll see the reticularis is this bottom region of the cortex, so we'll call this ZR. We call this region ZF, zona fasciculata, and we call this top region zona glomerulosa. And I always tell my students in lab to look for the capsule because that's going to help orient yourself. We know the capsule is going to be made up of connective tissue, so this is going to look very different from the cortex region situated below it. So if you find the capsule, right away you have found the zona glomerulosa, and then you're just going to look at the arrangement of cells to tell the difference between the zona glomerulosa and the zona fasciculata, and then to tell the zona fasciculata apart from the zona reticularis. Now reticularis means mesh network, and so whereas cells in the zona fasciculata were kind of stacked in columns, the zona reticularis, they kind of weave between one another. The class of hormones that come from the zona reticularis are androgens. And a specific example would be DHEA, which stands for dehydroepiandrosterone. After puberty in males, the androgen testosterone is released in much greater quantity by the testes. So the amount of androgen secreted by the adrenal glands in males is usually so low that the effect is insignificant. In females, however, adrenal androgens play important roles. They promote sex drive or libido. They are converted into estrogens, which are feminizing sex steroids. And after menopause, when the estrogen levels from the ovaries stops, all female estrogens will come from the zona reticularis or the adrenal gland. Adrenal androgens also stimulate growth of axillary and pubic hair in boys and girls when they start puberty, and it contributes to the prepubertal growth spurt. What controls androgen secretion is not fully understood, but it does appear that there is a role for ACTH, one of the hormones that come from the anterior pituitary, in mediating secretion of hormones from the zona reticularis. Okay. So moving on, The next thing we need to talk about are the hormones that come from the adrenal medulla. And I said we would focus on two, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so the adrenal medulla is easy to locate because it's at the center, and often we will find that cells in the cortex are packed tightly together. Cells in the medulla, there tends to be more space between them. So it looks lighter when you look at it underneath the microscope because it's not as densely packed with cells. So usually I tell students to look for kind of some gaps or holes in the tissue for the adrenal medulla, and you can kind of orient yourself with the spread of the regions of the cortex and then the medulla within the gland itself. The hormone producing cells in the adrenal medulla are called the chromaffin cells. They are stimulated to release hormone when they receive impulses from the autonomic nervous system. Right? So this was our example of nerve stimulation. Impulses from the autonomic branch of the nervous system will trigger the chromaffin cells to release their hormone, epinephrine or norepinephrine. Predominantly, epinephrine is the major hormone that comes from the adrenal medulla. About 80% of hormone secretion is epinephrine, and the remaining 20% is norepinephrine. And we know that their role is to intensify sympathetic responses that occur in other parts of the body. So they're going to enhance activity. And when we think about these particular hormones, we know that we can associate their secretion during times when the body is under stress. It could be good stress, like physical exercise, but it could also be bad stress. When I talk about sympathetic activities, we remember from our discussions in 107 that sympathetic refers to fight or flight response. And so when we think about the major organ systems that are going to be affected by epinephrine, norepinephrine secretion are going to be those body systems or tissues that are going to be important for fight or flight. And so if we think about what those would entail or what that would be, we know that the cardiovascular system is going to be a major target area for epinephrine, norepinephrine. And we talk about what's happening in the cardiovascular system. We know that when epinephrine is secreted, it can increase the heart rate. So it's going to modify the pace of the heart and cause it to beat faster. We know that it also can increase contractility of the heart. What I mean by that is how forcefully that heart muscle contracts. So when we increase contractility, it means it's pounding or it's contracting harder. There's more force, and that's what we associate with that pounding feeling in our chest when we are startled. Let's say you're driving down the road and a car in front of you brakes and you're startled, you slam on your brakes. One thing that you notice as an after effect is the pace of your heart has increased, and sometimes it feels like it's pounding harder in your chest. So that's what I mean by increased contractility. Another target area would be the respiratory system. It's going to cause the trachea to dilate, and as the trachea dilates, that means more air can move in to the lungs, and that's going to lead to a quicker exchange of gases and get oxygen into the tissue. And we know that that's going to be important because it's going to drive ATP synthesis, right? Another major area would be the nervous system because it's going to make us hyper alert or hyper aware, and that's going to be important for survival, right? When we think about fight or flight. And then lastly, put it up here, we have the muscular system, right? Because the skeletal muscle is going to need that added delivery of oxygen in the blood to convert to ATP in order to drive our fleeing process, right? Muscle contraction that will allow us to be mobile or free. So when we think about major systems that are going to be affected with epinephrine, norepinephrine secretion, it's going to be those body systems that are going to be most important for mediating our fight or flight response. And that would include the cardiovascular system, the respiratory, the nervous, and the muscular system. The very last gland that I want to talk about is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a small gland that's attached to the roof of the third ventricle of the brain. Kind of resembles a pine cone. And the cells that are located within the pineal gland that release hormone are known as pinealocytes. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, which is an immune hormone derived from serotonin. And melatonin contributes to the setting of the body's biological clock, right? Which is what kind of sets our cycle of when we're asleep and when we're awake. In response to visual input from the eyes, right, or the retina, the suprachiasmatic nucleus stimulates sympathetic postganglionic neurons of the superior cervical ganglion, which in turn stimulate the pinealocytes of the pineal gland to secrete melatonin in a rhythmic pattern. With low levels of melatonin secreted during the day and significantly higher levels secreted at night. So what this means is that when there is low visual input, when the room is dark, when our eyes are closed, when we're not being stimulated by what we're viewing, bright lights, computer screens, etc., it's going to lead to an increase in melatonin. And that's why you start to feel sleepy in dark settings, right, when there's low visual input, because melatonin secretion is increasing. When we are awake, our eyes are open, and that means light can pass through the eye and hit the retina. And that is going to cause a suppression of melatonin secretion. And so the levels of melatonin should go down. And that's why we tend to be awake during daylight hours. And so that's what I mean by the body's biological rhythm. Low visual input leads to a higher secretion or higher levels of melatonin. That's going to make you sleepy or stay asleep. As we have an increase in visual input, that's going to reduce melatonin secretion, and that's what sets your body's sleep-wake cycle. During sleep, plasma levels of melatonin increase tenfold and then decline to a low level again before waking. Small doses of melatonin given orally can induce sleep and reset daily rhythms, which might be beneficial for workers who have to work shifts, right? And so they're alternating between a daylight setting and a nighttime setting or nighttime hours. And so sometimes that can interfere with their sleep-wake cycle. It can be very difficult for them to get adequate amounts of sleep. Melatonin levels are higher in children and they decline as we age into adulthood. One thing that I wanted to talk about, I usually talk about it in the spring because we're in the middle of winter, but there's a disorder known as SAD, or seasonal affective disorder. It's a type of depression that afflicts some people during the winter months when the daytime hours are shorter. And it's thought to be due in part to the overproduction of melatonin. Full spectrum bright light therapy, which means repeated doses to exposure of an artificial light that's as bright as sunlight, provides relief for some people and helps to alleviate these symptoms associated with SAD. It also appears that 3 to 6 hours of bright light therapy can speed up recovery from jet lag, which is common among people who have to travel across several time zones for work, right? So sometimes bright light therapy is used to help minimize the symptoms that might be associated with jet lag or seasonal affective disorder. All right, so that kind of concludes all of the endocrine glands that we're going to talk about in this chapter. Like I said, we're going to continue to talk about the endocrine system because there are a lot of cells in a variety of different body systems that have endocrine function. And so you'll notice in your text that it goes through and lists some of the functions for all those different cell types. But we're going to revisit those as we visit the different body systems. So I'm going to stop here today. This will be the end of lecture 3. The last thing I need to talk about with the endocrine system is the stress response. So that'll be our discussion for lecture 4. And at the end of that, we will have covered the endocrine system and be ready to move into cardiovascular.